The wind that howled off the Bay of Biscay on the morning of January the 16th, 1809, carried with it the biting salt spray of the Atlantic and the unmistakable scent of impending doom. On the rugged, granite coast of Galicia, in the far northwest corner of Spain, the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force stood with their backs to the grey, churning ocean. To look at them, you would hardly recognize the proud army that had marched out of Lisbon months earlier with flags flying and bands playing. These men were no longer the spit-and-polish soldiers of the King's regulations. They were spectres. Their red coats were bleached by sun and blackened by the smoke of 100 skirmishes, hanging in tatters from gaunt frames. Many were barefoot, their boots long since disintegrated on the frozen mountain roads, leaving bloody footprints in the Galician frost. They were starving, riddled with typhus, and exhausted beyond the limits of human endurance. They stood on the lower slopes of the Monte Miro, a precarious position dominated by the rocky heights above them, and looking down from those heights was the reason for their misery. Marshal Nicolas Soult, one of Napoleon's most capable and ruthless commanders, had arrived. The French army, the Grand Armée, the conquerors of Europe, filled the horizon. Their blue uniforms were clean, their bellies were full, and their artillery was positioned on the high ground, the cannons, black muzzles pointing directly down into the huddled mass of the British lines. From a military standpoint, the situation was not merely desperate, it was catastrophic. The British were trapped in a classic bottleneck. Behind them lay the town of Corunna and the harbour. In that harbour, bobbing on the tide, were the masts of the Royal Navy transport fleet, hundreds of ships sent from England to rescue them. They were the wooden walls of salvation, agonizingly close, yet impossibly far. The embarkation had begun, but it was too slow. The French were too close. Marshal Soult knew that if he could shatter the thin, wavering British line, he would not just defeat an army, he would drive it into the sea. It would be a massacre of medieval proportions, a Dunkirk a century before its time, but with no channel crossing to save them from the bayonets of the French infantry. The silence that hung over the battlefield that morning was heavy, broken only by the cry of seagulls and the ominous rumble of gun carriages being wheeled into position on the French ridge. Inside the British ranks, the mood was a strange mixture of sullen resentment and grim determination. These men had spent the last 3 weeks in a retreat that had become a byword for hell. They had marched 250 miles through blizzards and mountain passes, pursued relentlessly by a French force 3 times their number. They had seen their comrades freeze to death by the roadside. They had seen women and children of the camp followers left behind in the snow, and they had been forced to shoot their own horses to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. They had been humiliated, harried, and hunted. But now, with the sea at their backs and nowhere left to run, a change came over them. They were no longer running. They were cornered animals, and as any hunter knows, there is nothing more dangerous than a beast with no escape route. Watching them from a vantage point near the village of Elvenia was their commander, Lieutenant General Sir John Moore. At 47 years old, Moore was the finest soldier Britain possessed. He was not a stiff aristocrat who had bought his commission and viewed his men as cannon fodder. He was a reformer, a tactical genius, and a man who had dedicated his life to the welfare of the private soldier. But as he looked out at the overwhelming French numbers gathering on the skyline, Moore must have felt the crushing weight of history bearing down upon him. He knew what London was saying about him. He knew the politicians were already sharpening their knives, calling this campaign a disaster, calling him a failure for retreating. He knew that if his army was destroyed here, Britain would be left defenseless, and Napoleon's shadow would lengthen across the entire world. Moore sat on his horse, his face calm, betraying none of the turmoil that must have churned within. He knew the terrain was against him. The French held the great battery on the ridge, giving them a plunging fire that could tear through his ranks. He had been forced to position his men on the lower ridge, the Monte Miro, simply because he didn't have enough soldiers to cover the higher ground. It was a tactical nightmare. He had barely 16,000 men fit to hold a musket. Soult had 20,000, including heavy cavalry and a massive superiority in artillery. By all the rules of war, the British should have surrendered. But Moore had drilled something into these men, a new kind of discipline, forged not just on the parade ground, but in the concept of mutual respect and skirmishing warfare. He had created the light infantry, men trained to think, to shoot accurately and to move with speed. As the French drums began to beat in the distance, sounding the pas de charge, Moore rode along the lines. He didn't give grand speeches about glory or empire. He spoke to the regiments by name. He reminded the 42nd Highlanders of their courage in Egypt. He nodded to the 95th Rifles, the men clad in green who were his own creation. He was preparing them for a final stand. The tragedy of Corunna is that it should never have happened. The British government had sent this small army into the heart of a continent ablaze, believing the Spanish armies would support them. They had been wrong. The Spanish armies had evaporated like mist before the French advance. Moore had found himself alone, deep in enemy territory, with Napoleon himself, the emperor, marching to cut him off. The retreat that followed was a masterclass in survival, a desperate race to the coast that had stripped the army of everything but its muskets and its honor. Now the race was over. The time for maneuvering was done. The afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the broken ground of vineyards and stone walls that separated the two armies. A single cannon shot rang out from the French heights, the ball tearing into the earth near the British center. Then another. Then the roar of the entire French battery. Through the clearing smoke, the dark blue columns of Soult's infantry began to descend the slope, moving like a slow, unstoppable tide toward the village of Elvenia. The French soldiers, marching with the confidence of men who had conquered Vienna and Berlin, the ragged red line waiting for them must have looked pathetic. They expected the British to break. They expected the panic to set in, for the rout to begin, for the slaughter to commence. They did not know that they were walking into the fire of the most disciplined musketry in the world. They did not know that the man watching them from the ridge had prepared his whole life for this specific moment of impossible crisis. This is the story of a battle that was fought not for conquest, but for survival. It is the story of a day that should have been a massacre, but instead became a legend. It is the story of how a broken, starving army turned and mauled the French eagle, and of the general who saved 23,000 lives, only to pay for their safety with his own. The Battle of Corunna was about to begin. To understand why Sir John Moore and his ragged scarecrows were backed against the Atlantic Ocean that freezing January, we must first pull our gaze away from the blood-stained snow of Galicia and cast it across the terrified map of Europe in the year 1808. It is difficult for us now, safe in the comfort of retrospect, to truly grasp the suffocating dread that Napoleon Bonaparte inspired in the hearts of his enemies. This was not the declining Napoleon of 1814, nor the desperate gambler of Waterloo. This was the emperor at his absolute zenith, a colossus who bestrode the continent like a modern Caesar. By 1808, the French Empire was not merely a nation, it was a leviathan that had swallowed the old world whole. The great powers that had once stood against France had been smashed with terrifying efficiency. Austria had been humbled at Austerlitz, Prussia had been dismantled at Jena, Russia had been forced into an uneasy alliance on a raft at Tilsit. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the tricolor flew unopposed. The monarchs of Europe were either Napoleon's puppets, his prisoners, or his terrified allies. There was only one stubborn, irritating exception to this continental hegemony: Great Britain. But Britain was an island power, a whale trying to fight an elephant. The Royal Navy commanded the seas, protecting the white cliffs of Dover, but on land, Britain was impotent. The British Army was small, volunteer-based, and widely regarded by European powers as a negligible force, good for colonial policing in India or the Caribbean, perhaps, but utterly incapable of standing in the line of battle against the massed conscript armies of the French Empire. Napoleon knew this. He dismissed the British Army as a collection of distinct regiments with no soul, led by aristocrats who knew more about fox hunting than flanking maneuvers. To strangle this island defiance, Napoleon imposed the continental system, a Europe-wide embargo designed to bankrupt London by cutting off all trade. To enforce this blockade, the emperor turned his eyes to the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, was refusing to close its ports. Spain, ostensibly a French ally, was unstable and corrupt. In a moment of hubris that would ultimately decide his fate, Napoleon decided simply to take them both. He poured troops across the Pyrenees, ostensibly to guard the coast, But then, with the flick of a pen, he deposed the Spanish king and installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne in Madrid. It was a breathtaking act of political gangsterism. He believed the Spanish peasantry would welcome the enlightened French rule. He was wrong. On the 2nd of May, 1808, the 2 de Mayo, the people of Madrid rose up. They fought with knives, stones, and flower pots against the Mamelukes and grenadiers of the Imperial Guard. The uprising was crushed with brutal efficiency, captured for eternity in the nightmares of Goya, but the spark had been lit. The Spanish ulcer had begun. Across the scorching plains and jagged mountains of Spain, the population took up arms. It was a savage, shapeless war of assassination and ambush, the guerrilla or little war. In London, the news of the Spanish uprising was received with a euphoria that bordered on delirium. The British cabinet, led by the Duke of Portland, but driven by the War Secretary Lord Castlereagh and the Foreign Secretary George Canning, saw a golden opportunity. For years, they had been looking for a battlefield where they could fight France on land. Now, an entire nation had risen against the tyrant. The logic in Westminster was dangerously simple. If Britain sent an army to support the Spanish patriots, surely the French would be swept back across the Pyrenees. This optimism, however, was built on a foundation of profound ignorance. The politicians in London, tracing lines on maps in their comfortable offices, had no concept of the harsh reality of Spanish geography, a land of barren plateaus and few roads, where an army could starve even in friendly territory. Nor did they understand that the Spanish armies they were so eager to support were ill-equipped, disorganized, and led by squabbling generals who refused to cooperate with one another. Into this cauldron of chaos, they threw Sir John Moore. He was given command of the British forces in Portugal with orders to march into Spain and cooperate with the Spanish generals to drive the French out. The instructions were vague, the maps were inaccurate, and the intelligence was non-existent. Moore was essentially being asked to walk blindfolded into a bare pit. Yet, the mood in England remained jubilant. They expected a parade. They expected a swift, glorious campaign that would topple the Corsican ogre. But the ogre was awake. When news reached Paris of a British army marching into Spain and of a minor French defeat at Belaine, Napoleon's fury was terrible to behold. He did not simply send reinforcements. He decided to end the matter personally. He dissolved the Grand Armée in Germany, the veterans of Austerlitz and Friedland, the finest killing machine the world had ever seen, and marched them south. 200,000 hardened soldiers, men who had marched across Europe and back, began to flood through the mountain passes into Spain. Leading them was the emperor himself. His objective was cold and specific. He wrote to his brother Joseph, "I am starting to drive the leopard into the sea." He did not care about the Spanish insurgents. He could crush them at his leisure. His target was the British army. He wanted to trap Moore, destroy him, and parade the captured British generals through the streets of Paris. This would be the end of British interference on the continent forever. So as the winter of 1808 closed in, the trap was set. Sir John Moore, with roughly 23,000 men and very little cavalry, was marching north from Lisbon into the vast, unknown interior of Spain. He was marching toward a phantom ally that had already been defeated, and straight into the path of an imperial avalanche 10 times his size. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not merely a colonial skirmish. This was the entire disposable military strength of Great Britain. If Moore's army was encircled and destroyed, which was exactly what Napoleon intended, Britain would have no army left to defend its own shores. The war would be lost. The island would be defenseless. And as Moore crossed the border into Spain, the first snows began to fall, burying the roads and the passes, as if the land itself was preparing a shroud for the disaster to come. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy that was about to unfold in the snows of Spain, we must first understand the man at the center of the storm. History has a cruel habit of remembering Sir John Moore primarily for his death. The romanticized, tragic hero carried off the field at the moment of victory. It captures the poetry of the man, but it completely misses the point of his life. To view Moore simply as a martyr is to ignore the fact that he was, without question, the most brilliant military innovator of his generation. He was the architect of the modern British soldier. In the late 18th century, the British Army was, to put it bluntly, a rigid, archaic institution creaking under the weight of its own obsolescence. It was an army modeled on the lessons of Frederick the Great, designed for the geometric precision of the parade ground rather than the chaos of the battlefield. The ranks were filled with what the Duke of Wellington would later famously call the scum of the earth, men driven to enlist by gin, poverty, or the magistrate. Discipline was maintained not through morale or professional pride, but through the terror of the lash. A soldier was expected to be a mindless automaton, standing in a straight line, loading and firing on command until he was killed. Independent thought was not just discouraged, it was considered a form of mutiny. The officer corps was often little better. Commissions were bought and sold like commodities. A wealthy aristocrat could purchase a colonelcy for his son, regardless of whether the boy had ever seen a day of combat or knew which end of a musket the ball came out of. Meritocracy was a foreign concept. It was an army led by amateurs and manned by slaves, and against the fanatical, fast-moving citizen armies of revolutionary France, it was woefully outmatched. Enter John Moore. Born in Glasgow, the son of a doctor and scholar, Moore was a different breed entirely. He was an intellectual in a profession that often despised intellect. He had seen combat as a teenager in the American War of Independence, where he watched the rigid British lines picked apart by American skirmishers hiding in the woods. He had served in the West Indies and in the disastrous campaigns in Holland. He had seen the waste of life caused by incompetence and stupidity, and it burned a cold fury into his soul. Moore believed that the British soldier was capable of better. He believed that if you treated a man like a human being, he would fight like a hero. His opportunity to prove this came in 1803. With Napoleon massing an invasion fleet at Boulogne, just across the Channel, the British government desperately needed a force capable of meeting the French on equal terms. They gave Moore command of a brigade at Shorncliffe Camp, on the cliffs of Kent. It was here, overlooking the grey waters of the Channel, that Moore established what would become known as the Shorncliffe experiment. Shorncliffe was less a military camp and more a laboratory of war. Here Moore took the 52nd, the 43rd, and the newly formed 95th Rifles, and he began to strip away the rotting veneer of the 18th century. He threw out the lash. In Moore's camp, discipline was maintained through honor and mutual respect. He told his officers that it was their duty to know their men, to know their names, their families, their strengths, and their weaknesses. This was revolutionary. For a British officer to treat a private soldier as an individual was almost unheard of. But the revolution went deeper than manners. Moore was training a new kind of warrior, the light infantryman. Unlike the heavy line infantry, who stood shoulder to shoulder, these men were trained to fight in loose order, to use the terrain for cover, to move at a jog, the famous light bob's pace of 140 steps a minute. Most importantly, they were trained to think. Moore drilled them to act on their own initiative. If an officer was killed, the sergeant took over. If the sergeant fell, the corporal led. If the corporal died, the private knew the objective and how to achieve it. Central to this experiment was the weapon of the 95th, the Baker rifle. While the standard Brown Bess musket was smoothbore and inaccurate beyond 100 yards, the Baker was rifled. It took longer to load, forcing the ball down the grooves required a mallet, but in the hands of a Shorncliffe-trained marksman, it was lethal at 300 yards. Moore created a culture of marksmanship. While other regiments discouraged live fire practice to save money on powder, Moore had his men shooting constantly. He turned shooting into a sport, rewarding the best shots with badges of merit. The result was the creation of an elite corps that would become the envy of Europe. The men of the Light Division, the Green Jackets and the Light Bobs, were cocky, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to Old Jack, as they called Moore. They did not fight because they were terrified of their officers, they fought because they believed they were the best. They moved like ghosts and hit like a sledgehammer. This was the tool that Sir John Moore had forged. As he marched into Spain in 1808, he wasn't just leading an army, he was leading the vindication of his life's work. The tragedy, of course, was the timing. The Shorncliffe system was designed for the offensive, for the sharp, aggressive maneuver warfare that would later tear the French apart in the peninsula. It was not designed for a desperate, starving retreat through the mountains in the dead of winter. Yet paradoxically, it was exactly this training that would save them. When the structure of the main army began to collapse under the misery of the retreat, It was the discipline of the light division, rooted in that mutual respect and individual pride, that held the rearguard together. The Shorncliffe experiment was about to face the ultimate field test. Moore had built a machine of war that relied on the human spirit rather than the fear of the whip, and he was now about to ask that machine to perform the impossible, to hold back the entire might of the French Empire while the rest of the army ran for its life. By mid-November 1808, Sir John Moore rode into the ancient university city of Salamanca. The rain was falling in sheets, turning the dusty Spanish roads into quagmires of sucking mud, a grim precursor to the winter that was closing in. But the weather was the least of Moore's concerns. As he dismounted and established his headquarters in a draughty palace near the plaza, he was expecting to hear the thunder of friendly cannon and the cheers of Spanish allies. He had been promised that 3 great Spanish armies, numbering over 100,000 men, were massed on the Ebro River, ready to shield his arrival and join him for the push on Madrid. Instead, he found silence, and in that silence, the terrible truth began to dawn. There were no Spanish armies. They had not just been defeated, they had been obliterated. While Moore was marching his men across the Portuguese border, Napoleon had unleashed his blitzkrieg. The Spanish armies of the left, center, and right had been smashed at battles like Espinosa and Tudela. They had scattered like chaff in the wind. The great Spanish uprising that the politicians in London had spoken of with such breathless enthusiasm was, for all military purposes, dead. Moore was not marching to join a grand coalition. He was marching into a void. The situation facing Moore at Salamanca was the stuff of nightmares for a commanding officer. He was deep in hostile territory, 300 miles from the safety of the sea. His army was not even fully assembled. His artillery and cavalry under Sir John Hope had taken a different route to avoid the mountains and were still days away, leaving Moore with only his infantry. And somewhere to the north and east, the French juggernaut was rolling forward, unchecked and undefeated. For weeks Moore sat in Salamanca, paralyzed by a lack of intelligence and an abundance of delusion. The fog of war was thick and suffocating. Reports came in daily, contradictory and confusing. Some said the French were retreating, others said they were at the gates. But the most dangerous enemy Moore faced in those weeks was not Marshal Soult or the Emperor. It was the British diplomat, John Hookham Frere. Frere was the British plenipotentiary to the Spanish junta, a man of letters, a poet, and a politician, with absolutely no understanding of warfare. From the safety of the south, Frere bombarded Moore with insulting letters. He accused Moore of timidity. He demanded that the British army attack Madrid immediately to save the Spanish soul. He painted pictures of a Spanish populace rising en masse, claiming that all they needed was the sight of British redcoats to turn the tide. Frere even went so far as to suggest that if Moore retreated, he would be branded a traitor to his country. Moore, the consummate professional, read these letters with cold fury. He knew what Frere did not, that attacking Madrid with 20,000 infantry against Napoleon's 200,000 veterans was not heroism, it was murder. It would be the end of the British army. His instinct, honed by 30 years of soldiering, told him to retreat. The prudent move was to fall back to Portugal, unite with his artillery, and defend Lisbon. It was the safe choice. It was the logical choice. And initially, that is exactly what he prepared to do. He issued orders for the army to prepare to withdraw. But then the picture changed. A single, captured dispatch bag fell into British hands. It revealed the true disposition of the French forces. It showed that while Napoleon was driving hard for Madrid and the south to crush the last remnants of Spanish resistance, a smaller French force under Marshal Soult was isolated to the north, in the province of Leon. Soult was guarding the French lines of communication, the lifeline back to France, and he was unaware of Moore's presence. Moore looked at the map, and in that moment he saw a sliver of opportunity. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. If he retreated to Portugal now, he saved his army, but he abandoned Spain. The French would overrun the south, take Seville and Cadiz, and the war would be effectively over. But if he ignored the safety of Portugal and marched north, away from his supply lines, away from the sea, he could strike at Soult. It wasn't about defeating Soult. Moore was too much of a realist to think he could win the war with one battle. The goal was strategic distraction. If he threatened Soult and the French communications, Napoleon would be forced to stop his conquest of the south. The emperor could not afford to have a British army rampaging through his rear areas, cutting him off from Paris. Napoleon would have to turn his entire vast machine around to hunt Moore down. It was a decision to act as bait. Moore decided to dangle his army in front of the lion to lure the beast away from its prey, knowing full well that once the lion turned, he would have to run for his life. He wrote to Castlereagh in London, his pen scratching out the ominous truth: "I shall move to Valladolid, from whence I can retreat to Corunna. I mean to proceed bridle in hand, for if the bubble bursts and Madrid falls, we shall have a run for it." A run for it. It was a colossal understatement. Moore knew he was essentially signing the death warrant for hundreds, perhaps thousands of his men. He knew that by marching north, he was cutting off his own retreat to Portugal. If he was caught, there would be no escape. The only way out would be a desperate march across the Galician mountains to the port of Corunna in the far north, terrain that was brutal even in summer and lethal in winter. But the honor of the army and the desperate need to buy time for Spain demanded it. On December 11th, the order was given. The retreat to Portugal was cancelled. The army would advance. The soldiers, who had been grumbling about the proposed retreat, cheered as they turned their faces toward the enemy. They did not know the strategic nuance. They only knew they were finally going to fight. Moore watched them march out of Salamanca, the columns of red snaking through the grey winter landscape. He must have known he was walking into the lion's mouth. He was abandoning his base, his supplies, and his safety, staking everything on the hope that he could sting the French Empire hard enough to make it flinch, and then be fast enough to escape the retaliation. The Salamanca dilemma was resolved. The die was cast. The British army was marching north, into the snow, and into the history books. The days leading up to Christmas 1808 were defined by a cruel and deceptive optimism. For the common British soldier, oblivious to the grand strategy playing out in the chateaus of generals, things seemed to be going splendidly. They were advancing. The shame of the long wait in Salamanca was forgotten. They were marching through the freezing plains of Leon, looking for a fight, and they had found the edge of one. On the 21st of December, the British cavalry, led by the brilliant and dashing Lord Paget, a man whose personal scandals were eclipsed only by his genius in the saddle, had surprised a French cavalry force at Sahagun. It was a sharp, brilliant little action in the snow. The 15th Hussars had charged and broken the French dragoons, taking nearly 200 prisoners. The victory sent a surge of electricity through the army. The French were not invincible. They could be beaten. Sir John Moore's plan was working. He was poised to strike Marshal Soult's isolated corps at the Carrion River. The order was drawn up. The attack was scheduled for Christmas Day. The British army prepared to deliver a blow that would ring across Europe. But 300 miles to the south, in the opulent palaces of Madrid, the jaws of the trap were beginning to creak open. Napoleon Bonaparte had been busy settling the affairs of his new conquest. He believed the war was effectively over. He was reviewing parades, drafting constitutions for Spain, and planning his return to Paris. As far as he was concerned, the British army was a non-entity, likely already cowering in the ports of Portugal preparing to flee. He had written them off. Then, late on the night of the 19th of December, a courier arrived in Madrid. He carried news that must have seemed hallucinated. The British were not retreating to Lisbon. They were not hiding. They were in the north, moving east. They were threatening the emperor's own supply lines. For a lesser man, this news might have caused panic. For Napoleon, it sparked a terrifying, volcanic energy. He instantly grasped the magnitude of Moore's audacity. The British lion had stepped out of its cage and swiped at the emperor's flank. Napoleon reportedly exclaimed to his staff, "Moore is the only general fit to contend with me, for I shall not catch him." It was a mark of respect, but it was the respect a hunter has for a dangerous wolf, a wolf that must be put down immediately. In that moment, the conquest of Spain became secondary. The invasion of Portugal was forgotten. The destruction of Sir John Moore became the sole obsession of the French Empire. What followed was one of the greatest logistical feats in military history. With a speed that defies belief even today, Napoleon spun his massive army around. He took 50,000 men, the Imperial Guard, the veteran corps of Ney, and hurled them northwards toward the Guadarrama Mountains. Nature itself tried to stop him. As the French army reached the Guadarrama passes, a blizzard of apocalyptic fury descended. The wind screamed through the rocky defiles, blinding the soldiers with ice and piling snow drifts chest-high. The artillery horses floundered and died. The men, hardened veterans of Austerlitz, began to lie down in the snow to die. The advance ground to a halt. But Napoleon would not be denied his prize. He dismounted from his horse. He walked to the front of the column, linking arms with his grenadiers. He trudged through the knee-deep drifts, his grey greatcoat whipped by the gale, personally leading the army through the storm. Driven by his sheer will, the French army crossed the mountains. They burst out onto the plains of Old Castile on the other side, moving at a pace that shattered all known march tables. They were covering 20-30 miles a day, ignoring exhaustion, ignoring hunger. They were a tidal wave of blue steel, rolling north to crush the British against the anvil of Marshal Soult's forces. Back in the north, Sir John Moore was unaware that the hammer was falling. He was still focused on Soult. The British army was coiled, ready to spring. The attack was set. Then, on the evening of the 23rd of December, the blow landed. But it was not a cannonball, it was a piece of paper. A message arrived from Moore's intelligence network, likely confirming reports from Spanish peasants who had seen the impossible speed of the French advance. The news was catastrophic. Napoleon was not in Madrid. He was in their rear. He had crossed the mountains. He was days, perhaps hours, away from cutting off Moore's retreat to the sea. The realization must have been sickening. Moore saw the map in his mind's eye with terrifying clarity. He was sandwiched. In front of him was Soult with 18,000 men. Behind him, racing to close the back door, was Napoleon with 50,000. If the two French forces met, the British army would be surrounded and annihilated. There would be no surrender, it would be total destruction. Moore did not hesitate. There was no time for a council of war, no time for debate. He knew that his strategic gamble had succeeded. He had drawn Napoleon away from the south, buying the Spanish patriots breathing room, but the price of that success was now due. The hunter had become the hunted. Orders went out immediately, cancel the attack. The confusion in the British ranks was absolute. The men were priming their muskets, sharpening their bayonets, eager to fight the French the next morning. Suddenly, the sergeants were shouting at them to pack up. Fires were extinguished. Baggage was loaded. The muttering began instantly. The soldiers felt betrayed. They wanted a fight, not a retreat. They did not understand that they were standing in the shadow of an avalanche. On Christmas Eve, 1808, the Great Retreat began. It did not start with a panic, but with a sullen, disciplined withdrawal. But as the columns turned their backs on the enemy and faced the dark, freezing road to the coast, the weather turned with them. The skies bruised purple and black, and the snow began to fall, softly at first, then with a relentless, smothering intensity. Moore had snapped the trap shut on himself to save Spain, and he had slipped his leg out at the very last second. But the race was not over. It had just begun. He had a head start of perhaps 12 hours. 12 hours to outrun the greatest military genius in history. 12 hours to get 23,000 men, women and horses over the unforgiving mountains of Galicia before the French cavalry rode them down. The road to Corunna lay ahead, and it would be paved with ice, blood and sorrow. The retreat to Corunna was not merely a military maneuver. It was a descent into the ninth circle of hell. As the British army turned its back on the plains of Castile and began the climb into the Galician mountains, the structure of civilization itself began to fray. The calendar said it was late December, the season of Advent and celebration, but for the 20,000 souls tramping through the sludge, time had dissolved into a monotonous, freezing loop of pain. The weather was the primary executioner. A storm of ferocious intensity slammed into the columns. It was a blizzard that howled with a physical weight, driving ice crystals into the exposed skin of the men until their faces were raw and bleeding. The road, if one could call the goat track they followed a road, disappeared under feet of snow or worse, turned into a knee-deep slurry of freezing mud that sucked the boots right off the soldiers' feet. Within days, thousands of British redcoats were marching barefoot. Their feet turned black with frostbite, cracking open to leave a trail of blood that the French vanguard could follow like a grim breadcrumb trail. But the true horror began at the town of Bembaba. The army had reached the town on New Year's Eve, stumbling out of the dark, starving and demoralized. They were angry. They felt their officers had led them on a fool's errand, marching them halfway across Spain only to run away without firing a shot. Discipline, which Moore had cultivated so carefully at Shorncliffe, hung by a thread. At Bembaba, that thread snapped. The soldiers discovered the town's vast wine cellars. These were not bottles of refined vintage, but immense vats of rough, potent Spanish red. The reaction was instant and feral. Starving men smashed open the casks, drinking directly from the flow until they vomited, then drinking again. They filled their canteens, their hats, even their boots with the liquid. The town descended into an orgy of drunkenness. It was a scene from a Bosch painting. Officers who tried to intervene were ignored or threatened with bayonets. Men lay in the streets, wallowing in the mud and wine, insensible to the world, singing slurred songs of home while the snow buried them alive. When the order came to move out the next morning, hundreds could not or would not stand. The rearguard, under the iron-willed Robert Crawford, tried to rouse them. They kicked the men, beat them with the flats of their swords, even pricked them with bayonets, screaming that the French were coming. But the stupor was too deep. In the end, the army had to leave them. As the rearguard marched out of Bembaba, they looked back to see a town littered with the unconscious bodies of their comrades. Then the French cavalry arrived. The French dragoons, riding hard on the heels of the retreat, swept into Bembaba like wolves into a sheep pen. They found the British stragglers stumbling through the streets, unarmed and bewildered. There was no battle. It was a slaughter. The dragoons rode them down, slashing left and right with their sabers. Men were hacked to pieces where they lay in the snow. The screams of the dying finally pierced the alcoholic haze of the survivors, sending a wave of panic rippling through the town, but it was too late. The wine of Bembaba had cost the army more casualties than a major battle. As the news of the massacre filtered up the line, a grim pall settled over the column. Moore was furious. He stopped the army at Villafranca, formed a hollow square, and had a marauder hanged in front of his comrades to restore order. He stood before them, his face gaunt, his voice cracking with emotion, berating them for their conduct. "I am the general who led you," he shouted, "but I cannot lead men who have become beasts." It was a desperate gamble to shame them back into discipline. It worked barely. But the road ahead offered no respite. They were entering the high passes now. The path wound along sheer precipices where a single misstep meant a fall of 1,000 feet into the gorge below. The exhaustion was so profound that men began to hallucinate. They saw warm fires and comfortable beds in the snowdrifts. They would wander off the road, sit down with a sigh of relief, and simply drift away into the sweet sleep of hypothermia. Their comrades, too weak to carry them, had to step over their bodies and keep walking. The most heartbreaking victims, however, were not the soldiers. Following the army was a tale of civilians, the wives and children of the regiment. In the 19th century army, families often accompanied the troops, washing clothes and cooking in exchange for half rations. Now, they were dying in droves. The descriptions left by survivors are almost too painful to read. Rifleman Harris, a chronicler of the retreat, described seeing a woman sat by the roadside, holding her baby. Both were frozen solid, statues of grief preserved in the ice. Another soldier recalled passing a woman who had gone into labor in the snow. There was no time to stop, no wagons to carry her. She was left there, amidst the blizzard, her newborn child's first and last sensation being the biting wind of Galicia. The cries of children, terrified and freezing, haunted the nights, mingling with the howling of the wind and the distant bugles of the pursuing French. The animals suffered equally. The cavalry horses, their shoes worn through, their legs shattered by the rocky ground, could go no further. To prevent them from being taken by the French, the order was given to shoot them. Hundreds of magnificent beasts were led to the edge of the road and dispatched. The sound of pistol shots echoed through the valleys for hours. At one point, near Nogales, the terrain became so steep that the wagons carrying the army's treasury, pound 25,000 in gold bullion, could not be hauled any further. Rather than let Napoleon have it, the chests were smashed open and the gold hurled down a ravine. Soldiers watched dully as a fortune in sovereigns cascaded into the abyss, too exhausted to even scramble after it. Yet amidst this apocalypse, there were flashes of the sublime human spirit. The rearguard, the elite light division, fought a fighting retreat that defies belief. They were the barrier between the chaotic mob of the main army and the French sabers. They marched, turned, fought, and marched again. They slept in the snow with their rifles cradled in their arms. They were commanded by Edward Paget and the fiery Robert Crawford, who marched on foot alongside his men to show them he shared their misery. When the French pressed too close, these scarecrows would turn, form a ragged line, and unleash a volley of such ferocity that the pursuers would recoil. They were the iron band that kept the barrel from bursting. By the time the army reached the mountains overlooking Corunna, they were unrecognizable. Their uniforms were rags, their bodies emaciated, their eyes hollow. They had marched over mountains that Napoleon had called impassable. They had survived starvation, typhus, and the French sword. They had shed their baggage, their women, and their weaker comrades along 200 miles of Spanish road. But they had made it. As the lead elements crested the final ridge on January 11th, a cry went up that rippled down the weary column. It was a sound not heard for months. The sea, the sea. There, grey and sullen under the winter sky, was the Atlantic. It was the end of the land. It was the promise of home. But as their eyes scanned the harbour, the cheers died in their throats. The bay was empty. The transport fleet had been delayed by storms. They were trapped. And behind them, the French drums were getting louder. The retreat was over. The battle for survival was about to begin. If the story of the main column's retreat to Corunna is a tragedy of breakdown and despair, the story of the rearguard is an epic of professional defiance. While the majority of the army stumbled through the snow in a haze of hunger and fatigue, the men at the back of the line, the reserve division under General Edward Paget and the cavalry under his brother, Lord Henry Paget, were fighting a very different kind of war. They were the shield wall. They were the only thing standing between the disorganized rabble of the main army and the ravenous pursuit of the French advance guard. To understand the miracle of the rearguard, one must appreciate the terrifying proximity of the enemy. For over 2 weeks, the French cavalry was never more than a few hours behind. The British rearguard marched with their ears pricked for the sound of hoofbeats. They slept, when they slept at all, with their muskets loaded and their hands on their swords. They were fighting a rolling battle, a constant, grinding engagement where they had to hold a bridge or a ridge just long enough for the baggage wagons to clear, then break contact, run to catch up, and turn to fight again. The cavalry, in particular, performed feats of endurance that bordered on the superhuman. Lord Paget, a man of scandalous reputation in London society, but absolute genius on the battlefield, led his regiments with a dashing aggression that stunned the French. Napoleon's cavalry, arguably the finest in Europe, expected to ride down a fleeing enemy. Instead, they found themselves repeatedly ambushed by British hussars who charged with a ferocity that belied their starving condition. The defining moment of this cavalry war came at the River Esla, near the town of Benevent. It was here that the elite of the French army, the chasseurs à cheval of the Imperial Guard, the Emperor's personal favourites, clad in green and gold, splashed across the river, eager to catch the British unaware. They were led by General Leopard, a close friend of Napoleon, a man who believed the leopards were already beaten. Lord Paget saw them crossing. He did not panic. He hid his men, the 10th Hussars and the pickets of the 3rd Hussars, behind the stone walls of the town, masking his numbers. He waited. He let the French elites cross the river, let them form up, let them believe they had the advantage. Only when the French were fully committed did Paget unleash his trap. The British hussars burst from cover, slamming into the French flank. The shock was absolute. The Emperor's favourites were shattered, driven back into the freezing river in a chaotic melee of sabres and splashing water. In the centre of the fray, General Leopard was cut off. His horse was wounded, and he was forced to surrender to a private of the 10th Hussars. It was a humiliation of the highest order for the French. Later that night, in a scene that perfectly encapsulates the strange chivalry of the era, the captured French general was invited to dinner at Sir John Moore's table. But the message sent to the French army was clear. The British might be retreating, but they were still lethal. As the retreat ground on, and the horses began to die from lack of fodder, the burden of the rearguard fell increasingly on the infantry of the reserve division. These were the battalions of the 20th, the 28th, the 52nd, and the 95th Rifles. While the rest of the army looted wine cellars and threw away their weapons, the reserve maintained an iron discipline. They were commanded by Edward Paget, a stern, uncompromising soldier who would walk up and down the lines during skirmishes, ignoring the French fire, keeping his men steady by the sheer force of his will. The reserve fought a dozen nameless skirmishes in the mist and rain, but their masterpiece occurred at the Bridge of Cacabelos on January the 3rd. The terrain was a bottleneck, a stone bridge spanning a gorge, with vineyards rising steeply on either side. It was the perfect defensive choke point. The British main body had crossed, and the reserve was holding the far bank when the French vanguard arrived. Leading the French was General Auguste Marie-François Colbert. He was young, famously handsome, and recklessly brave, riding a grey horse that made him a conspicuous target. He saw the British riflemen scattered in the vineyards, and with the arrogance of a man who had never known defeat, he ordered a charge. He believed he could sweep the bridge by sheer momentum. Waiting for him in the rocky scrub of the vineyard was a private of the 95th Rifles named Thomas Plunkett. The 95th were Moore's Shorncliffe-trained elite, armed with the Baker rifle. Unlike the smoothbore muskets used by the French, which were lucky to hit a barn door at 100 paces, the Baker was a precision instrument. Plunkett was a character, a drinker, a rogue, but he was also one of the finest shots in the army. As Colbert charged toward the bridge, waving his saber, Plunkett lay on his back, a peculiar position favored by riflemen for extreme stability, and wrapped the sling of his rifle around his arm. The distance was perhaps 400 yards, a range considered impossible for the era. Plunkett breathed out, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle cracked. General Colbert was struck instantly in the head and knocked from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. The French attack faltered, stunned by the death of their leader. A French trumpet major rushed forward to aid the fallen general. Plunkett reloaded, a slow process of hammering the ball down the rifling, aimed again, and fired. The trumpet major fell dead across his general's body. 2 shots, 2 kills, at extreme range. It was a moment that signaled a change in the nature of warfare. The massed columns and dashing bravery of the French were stopped cold by the calculated precision of the British riflemen. The French, demoralized by the loss of their golden boy Colbert, pulled back. The bridge was held. The army was safe for another day. But the cost to the rearguard was horrific. They were fighting by day and marching by night to keep up. They had no time to forage for food, no time to rest. They subsisted on raw turnips pulled from frozen fields and snow melted in their mouths. They were the last to arrive at the billets and the first to leave. Yet their morale remained rock solid. They looked with contempt upon the stragglers of the main army. They knew that they were the only thing keeping the Great Retreat from becoming a total capitulation. By the time they neared Corunna, the men of the reserve and the light companies were skeletal figures, their uniforms hanging in rags, their feet wrapped in bloody bandages. But they still marched in step. They still cleaned their weapons. When they formed a line, they did not waver. They had bought Sir John Moore the one thing he needed most: time. They had marched into the jaws of the French pursuit and jammed them open, allowing the rest of the army to slip through to the sea. As the reserve finally limped onto the heights overlooking Corunna, they were exhausted, but they were undefeated. And they would need every ounce of that hardened resolve, for the ships were not ready, and Marshal Soult was bringing up his heavy guns. Days leading up to the 16th of January were a strange, suspended purgatory. The British army was no longer running. It was coiled on the coast, panting for breath, waiting for the Royal Navy to save it. But before the battle could be joined, there was one final act of destruction to perform. On the 13th of January, the main powder magazine, situated 3 miles from Corunna, was detonated to prevent it from falling into French hands. It contained 4,000 barrels of gunpowder. The explosion was cataclysmic. Survivors described a tremor that shook the earth like a divine hammer blow, shattering windows in the town miles away. A mushroom cloud of white smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, raining debris and ash down upon the waiting armies. It was a spectacular, terrifying signal that the British were burning their bridges. There was no going back. There was only the sea or the grave. On the evening of the 14th, the sails finally appeared. The transports, over 100 of them, ghosted into the Bay of Beatonzoes, their masts a forest of salvation against the grey sky. A cheer went up from the ragged troops on the heights, a sound of raw, primal relief. Immediately, the evacuation of the sick and wounded began. It was a pitiable procession. Men with gangrenous limbs, men blinded by ophthalmia, men shivering with typhus were rowed out to the ships. With them went the cavalry horses that hadn't been shot, and crucially, the bulk of the British artillery. This decision to embark the artillery is the key to understanding the bloody nature of the coming battle. Sir John Moore, standing on the heights, looked at the terrain and made a cold calculation. The ground around Corunna was a nightmare of broken ridges, stone walls, sunken lanes, and hollows. It was terrible country for cavalry, which neutralized Soult's advantage in horsemen. But the geography presented a cruel dilemma. There were two ridges. The outer ridge, the heights of Penasquito, was high and commanding. It was the ideal defensive position, but it was too wide. To hold it, Moore would have needed 25,000 men. He had barely 15,000 fit for duty. If he stretched his line that thin, Soult would punch through it in an hour. So Moore was forced to abandon the high ground to the French. He pulled his army back to the lower, inferior ridge, the Monte Miro. It was a strong position, compact and defended by the terrain, but it had one fatal flaw. It was directly overlooked by the higher ridge. Soult could place his heavy cannons on the Penasquito heights and fire down onto the heads of the British troops. Moore was effectively placing his army in a shooting gallery, betting that his infantry could endure the bombardment long enough to hold off the French assault. It was a choice between being outflanked or being pounded. Moore chose the pounding. He deployed his meager force with the precision of a chess master. On the right, the place of honor and greatest danger, he placed the division of Sir David Bayard. Here, the lines were closest to the enemy, separated by a valley containing the village of Elvenia. In the center stood Hope's division. On the left, tucked away near the village of Iris, was Paggett's reserve, Moore's ace in the hole, hidden from French view. The morning of January, the 16th, dawned cold and bright. The men were stood to arms before daybreak, expecting the attack at dawn, the traditional time for military slaughter. But the sun rose and the valley remained silent. The French fires smoked on the opposite ridge. Figures could be seen moving, engineers, officers with telescopes, but no columns formed. By noon, a strange lethargy had settled over the field. Moore, believing that Soult would not attack that day, decided to continue the embarkation. He ordered Paggett's reserve to prepare to move to the harbor at sundown. The mood in the British lines lightened. Men began to cook their meager rations. Officers stripped off their grime-encrusted uniforms to wash in the streams. It seemed the great retreat would end not with a bang, but with a quiet slip away into the night. Then, at 1:30 in the afternoon, an almost civilized hour for a battle to commence, the French ridge erupted. Marshal Soult had not been idle. He had spent the morning dragging a massive battery of 12-pounder guns to the very edge of the rocky outcrop above Elvenia. Now he gave the signal. The great battery opened fire with a synchronized roar that shook the foundations of Corunna. The effect was immediate and horrific. Round shot, solid iron balls weighing 12 pounds screamed down from the heights, plunging into the exposed British lines. Because of the angle, the shots didn't just graze the earth. They plowed through files of men, smashing muskets and limbs with indiscriminate violence. The British infantry, trained to stand still under fire, had to endure this storm of iron without being able to fire a shot in return. They simply closed the gaps in the ranks, stepping over the mangled bodies of their messmates, and waited. Under the cover of this infernal bombardment, the French infantry attack began. 3 heavy divisions, commanded by Generals Mermet, Merle, and de Laborde, surged down the slope. They came on in the traditional French manner, dense columns of attack, covered by clouds of skirmishers. To the watching British, they looked like dark blue rivers pouring down the hillside, bayonets glittering like foam on the crest of a wave. The main fury of the assault was directed at the village of Elvenia. This was the pivot point. If Soult could take Elvenia and push through the valley, he would break the British right flank, cut the army off from the harbor, and drive them into the sea. It would be total annihilation. Defending Elvenia were the pick of the British line, the 4th King's Own, the 50th West Kent, and the 42nd Highlanders, the famous Black Watch. The clash at Elvenia was not a long-range firefight. It was a collision. The French skirmishers swarmed into the village, pushing back the British pickets. The fighting in the sunken lanes and stone houses was savage and confused. Men stabbed at each other through windows and blasted muskets at point-blank range in narrow alleys. The French momentum was irresistible. By sheer weight of numbers, they forced the British out of the village. The French columns began to deploy on the British side of the valley, their shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" rising above the crash of the guns. Sir John Moore was in Corunna arranging the boats when the cannonade began. He galloped to the field immediately, his staff struggling to keep pace. As he crested the ridge and saw the battle unfolding, his eyes lit up. Survivors later recalled that he looked almost happy. The agonizing responsibility of the retreat, the political bickering, the starvation, it all fell away. Here, amidst the smoke and the noise, was a problem he could solve. He saw instantly that the crisis was at Elvina. He spurred his horse towards the right flank, riding through the whistling cannonballs as if they were summer flies. He found the 42nd Highlanders falling back, confused and battered by the French artillery. The Highlanders were proud men, and they were wavering. They were out of ammunition, and the French columns were looming out of the smoke, massive and terrifying. Moore rode right into their midst. He knew these men. He had served with them in Egypt. He knew exactly what to say to stir the martial pride of a Scotsman. He raised his hat in the air, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Highlanders, remember Egypt." The effect was electric. The reference to their past glory acted like a jolt of adrenaline. The wavering stopped. The men of the Black Watch gripped their muskets, fixed their bayonets, and let out a roar that must have chilled the blood of the French conscripts facing them. They didn't wait for ammunition. They charged. At the same time, Moore spotted the 50th Regiment. They were commanded by Major Charles Napier, a man who would later become a legend of the Victorian Empire, but was then just a fiery officer eager for glory. Moore shouted to them, "Well done, the 50th, well done, my majors." Napier, inspired by his general's presence, led the 50th straight into the teeth of the French advance. They plunged into the murderous streets of Elvina. It was bayonet work now, brutal, exhausting, stabbing warfare. The British thin red line, so often mythologized as a static formation, became a living, aggressive beast. They drove the French back house by house, wall by wall. The French were stunned. They had expected a demoralized, broken army that would shatter at the first impact. Instead, they had walked into a buzzsaw. The British infantry, starving and ragged as they were fighting with a ferocity that the French had not encountered in all their wars across Europe. But the battle was far from won. Soult, seeing his attack stall, poured more men into the grinder. The great battery on the heights intensified its fire, focusing everything on the cluster of British regiments around Elvina. The air was thick with the acrid smog of black powder, the ground slick with blood. Moore remained right at the front, ignoring the pleas of his staff to move to a safer position. He sat on his horse, a calm, anchoring presence in the swirling chaos, directing the counterstrokes, feeding in reserves, watching the French moves with the eye of a master. He had stopped the rot. The line was holding, but the French still held the high ground and their guns were still thundering. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the corpse-strewn valley. The lines were drawn in the sand, and neither side was backing down. The climax of the campaign had arrived, and the cost was about to be paid in full. Battle for Elvina had descended into a suffocating, claustrophobic nightmare. To the observer on the ridge, the village was no longer a collection of stone cottages and garden walls. It was a cauldron of white smoke, intermittently lit by the orange flashes of musketry, from which emerged the screams of the dying and the guttural roar of close-quarter combat. The French 31st Light Infantry had pushed deep into the village, their momentum fueled by the belief that the British were already beaten. They were driving the British pickets back, step by bloody step, towards the sunken lane that ran like a scar across the British front. It was here, in this crucible of noise and confusion, that the Battle of Corunna would be decided. And it was here that Sir John Moore, the architect of the British soldier, would prove the validity of his life's work. Moore was not commanding from the rear. He was not studying a map in a tent. He was in the saddle, his horse dancing nervously as round shot from the great battery ploughed the earth around him. He was watching the 42nd Highlanders, the Black Watch. They were a regiment of immense pride, men who wore the kilt and the red hackle with a stoic ferocity, but they were in trouble. They had been hammered by the French artillery on the approach, and now, facing the dense blue columns emerging from the smoke of Elvina, they were wavering. The sheer weight of the French numbers was pushing them back. A gap was opening in the British line. If the 42nd broke, the road to the harbour would be open, and the army would be lost. Moore saw the hesitation. He knew that in battle, panic is a contagion. It moves faster than a galloping horse. He rode his mount straight to the front of the 42nd's line, ignoring the hail of lead buzzing like angry hornets through the air. He swept his hat off his head, his silhouette stark against the smoke-filled sky, and locked eyes with the exhausted Scotsmen. Highlanders, his voice boomed, cutting through the din of battle. Remember Egypt. It was a masterstroke of command. With 2 words, he bypassed their fear and tapped directly into their pride. He reminded them of the Battle of Alexandria in 1801, where they had destroyed Napoleon's invincibles. He reminded them that they were the Black Watch, and that the Black Watch did not run. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if a steel spine had been inserted back into the regiment. The backward step stopped. The men let out a ragged cheer, fixed their bayonets, and surged forward. They did not fire, many were out of ammunition anyway, they simply lowered their heads and charged. The impact was terrifying. The French, confident of victory, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of screaming, skirted warriors plunging out of the smoke. The bayonet, a weapon of psychological terror more than physical execution, did its work. The French front ranks, stunned by this sudden aggression from a beaten enemy, recoiled. But Moore was not done. To the right of the Highlanders stood the 50th Regiment, the Dirty Half-Hundred. They were commanded by Major Charles Napier, a man of reckless courage who would later become one of the great, eccentric generals of the Victorian era. On this day, however, he was simply a field officer with a burning desire to get at the enemy. Moore turned to them. "Well done, the 50th, well done, my majors," he shouted, his face flushed with the excitement of the moment. Napier took this as permission to unleash hell. He didn't just hold the line, he attacked. Leading from the front, waving his sword and shouting, "Forward!" He took the 50th straight into the stone maze of Elvina. The fighting here was savage. It was a brawl fought in gardens, in kitchens, and over cemetery walls. The 50th, inspired by Napier's madness, fought like demons. They drove the French out of the houses, pushing them back through the village with the bayonet and the butt stroke. Napier himself was everywhere, rallying his men, leading charges, until he was finally surrounded, stabbed in the back, and taken prisoner, but not before he had shattered the French momentum in the center. While the 42nd and the 50th were blunting the French nose in the bloodbath of Elvina, the true stroke of genius was unfolding on the British right flank. This was the sector held by the Reserve Division under General Edward Paget. Throughout the retreat, Paget's men, the 52nd, the 20th, and the 95th Rifles, had been the rearguard, the ones taking the punishment. Now hidden behind the swell of the terrain near the village of Iris, they were Moore's coiled spring. Marshal Soult, focusing everything on breaking the British centre, had extended his own left flank, trying to wrap around the British line. It was a classic manoeuvre, but in doing so, he had exposed his own side to the hidden British reserves. Moore had anticipated this. He had held Paget back for this exact second. Now he unleashed him. The 52nd Light Infantry, the quintessential Shorncliffe Regiment, moved out. They didn't advance in a rigid line. They moved with the fluid, predatory speed of skirmishers. They swung wide, using the broken ground for cover, and slammed into the flank of the attacking French division. The French were caught completely off guard. They were focused on the slaughter in Elvina, pushing forward, eyes fixed on the harbour. Suddenly, volley after volley of precise, withering musketry tore into their left side. The 95th Rifles, spread out in the scrub, began picking off French officers with terrifying accuracy. The French columns, so disciplined and formidable when moving forward, began to shudder. To be attacked on the flank is the nightmare of any formation. It turns a line of battle into a confused mob. The hunters had become the hunted. The French advance ground to a halt, then began to curl back on itself like a dying caterpillar. Back in the center, the situation had transformed. The British were no longer just holding, they were winning. The great battery on the heights was still firing, but its targets were moving forward out of the killing zone. The smoke of battle, thick and sulphurous, began to drift, revealing a sight that must have sickened Marshal Soult. His elite columns were dissolving. The redcoats, those starving, barefoot scarecrows he had chased for 300 miles, were not only standing their ground, they were advancing. The psychological shock to the French army cannot be overstated. They had marched across the Pyrenees believing they were chasing a rabbit. They had found a badger. Every time they tried to push, they were met with a disciplined volley that shattered their front ranks. The British fire discipline, drilled into them on the parade grounds of England, was relentless. Make ready, present, fire, a rolling thunder that never ceased. Moore remained at the vortex of the battle, near the 42nd. He was watching the fruition of his plans. The French attempt to turn his flank had been crushed by Paget. The French attempt to break his centre had been stopped by the 50th and the Highlanders. The road to the ships was secure. The army was safe. It was the vindication of every unpopular reform he had pushed through. It was proof that a British soldier, treated with respect and trained to think, was the superior of any conscript in Europe. The impossible odds, 20,000 Frenchmen with heavy artillery against 15,000 exhausted British with almost no cavalry, had been overcome not by a miracle, but by professionalism. As the afternoon wore on, the firing from the French side began to slacken. They had had enough. The blue waves receded from the village of Elvenia, leaving behind drifts of dead and wounded. The British line, battered and thinned, stood triumphant on the bloody ground they had reconquered. For Sir John Moore, sitting on his horse amidst the smoke, this should have been the moment of supreme satisfaction. He had done what the politicians said was impossible. He had saved the army. He had inflicted a tactical defeat on a Marshal of France. He had proven that the British army was a force to be reckoned with on the continent. The counterstroke was complete. The trap had failed. But the gods of war are capricious, and they demand a price for such victories. As the cheers of the 42nd Highlanders rang out, marking the repulse of the French, a single cannon on the heights above Elvenia fired a last, spiteful shot. It was a random round, fired blindly into the smoke. It arced through the air, invisible and silent, until the moment of impact. The time was roughly 4:30 p.m. The battle was won. The tragedy was about to begin. The sun was beginning to dip towards the Atlantic horizon, casting long, melancholic shadows across the corpse-strewn valley of Elvenia. The roar of the battle, which had shaken the very air for hours, was finally starting to recede. The French columns, broken and demoralized by the relentless British volleys, were pulling back towards the heights. The impossible odds had been defied. The army was safe. Sir John Moore sat on his horse, watching the 42nd Highlanders driving the enemy back. He was animated, flushed with the adrenaline of command and the profound relief that comes when a desperate gamble pays off. He was talking to his friend and aide-de-camp, Colonel Henry Hardinge. They were discussing the next move, the final consolidation of the line before the sun set completely. It was a moment of professional triumph. Then the air was rent by a sound like a tearing canvas. It was a single round shot, fired from the French battery on the heights. It was likely a blind shot, fired in frustration rather than calculation. It struck Moore on the left shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. The impact was catastrophic. The solid iron ball, weighing 12 pounds and traveling at hundreds of miles an hour, smashed through his epaulette. It shattered his collarbone, pulverized the shoulder joint, and tore away the flesh of his left breast, leaving the heart exposed. The force of the blow knocked him clean out of the saddle, slamming him onto the hard, rocky ground. Colonel Hardinge dismounted instantly, horror-struck. He rushed to the general's side, expecting to find him dead. The wound was hideous. Moore's left arm was hanging by nothing more than a few shreds of skin and muscle. The ribs over his heart were broken and stripped bare. By all medical logic of the time, he should have been unconscious or screaming in agony. But Sir John Moore did neither. As Hardinge knelt beside him, he saw Moore trying to raise himself up on his right arm. His eyes were not on his ruined shoulder. They were fixed intently on the 42nd Highlanders. He was watching the regiment he had just rallied. He watched them pressing forward, pushing the French back. Only when he saw that their line was advancing did his head sink back. A faint, relieved smile touched his lips. His first thought, even as his lifeblood poured onto the Spanish soil, was for the battle. A group of soldiers from the 42nd and the Guards, seeing their commander fall, rushed over with a blanket to carry him off the field. The pain of being moved must have been excruciating, yet Moore remained lucid. As they lifted him, the hilt of his sword, the weapon of his rank and his honor, got tangled in the wound. Hardinge, trying to spare his friend unnecessary agony, reached down to unbuckle the belt and remove the sword. Moore stopped him. With a voice that was weak but distinct, he whispered, "It is as well as it is. I had rather it should go out of the field with me." It is a sentence that defines the man. Even in death, he was a soldier first. He wanted to leave the battlefield armed, wearing the uniform of his king, with his sword at his side. He was not a victim, he was a general departing his command. The journey to the rear was a slow, sorrowful procession. The soldiers carrying the blanket wept openly. Every few minutes, Moore made them stop. He would ask them to turn him around so he could look back at the field. He listened to the firing. As the sound of the British musketry grew more distant and the French fire slackened, he knew the day was won. They carried him into Corunna to a house near the harbour. The surgeons arrived, took one look at the wound and shook their heads. There was nothing to be done. The damage was too extensive. It was a matter of time and not much of it. Moore lay on a mattress, his life ebbing away with the fading light. The room filled with his staff officers, men like Colonel Anderson, his oldest friend, and Hardinge. These were hardened soldiers, men who had seen the horrors of war from the West Indies to Egypt, yet they were breaking down. Moore, the dying man, was the one comforting them. He was in terrible pain, but his mind remained sharp. He asked repeatedly, "Are the French beaten?" When he was assured that they were, that the embarkation was safe, he seemed to find peace. His thoughts turned to the men he had led. He spoke of the officers who had distinguished themselves. He asked after Paget. He worried about the reputation of the army. He knew that the retreat had been controversial. He knew the politicians in London were looking for a scapegoat. He feared that his death would not be enough to silence the critics who called the campaign a disaster. "I hope the people of England will be satisfied," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I hope my country will do me justice." It was the plea of a man who had given everything, his intellect, his energy, his reputation, and now his life, in service of a nation that often misunderstood him. He didn't want glory, he just wanted to be understood. He wanted England to know that he had made the right choice, that he had saved the army, that he had done his duty. As the evening wore on, his breathing became labored. He turned to his old friend, Colonel Anderson. "Anderson," he said, "you know that I have always wished to die this way." It was the truth. Moore was a man of the Enlightenment, but he was also a romantic. He had lived for the army. To die in bed, old and forgotten, would have been a purgatory for him. To die at the moment of victory, having saved his men, was the only ending that fit the narrative of his life. The end came quietly. He pressed Anderson's hand. He remembered his mother asking that she be told gently. And then silence. Sir John Moore, the saviour of the British Army, was dead. Outside, the sounds of the evacuation continued. The rumble of wagon wheels on cobblestones, the shouts of sergeants, the creaking of oars. The army he had saved was leaving. They were boarding the ships that would take them back to England, back to safety. They were leaving him behind. It is a scene of profound poignancy. The general who had marched them through the snow, who had held them together by the sheer force of his personality, who had turned them from a rabble back into an army, lay dead in a foreign room while his men sailed away. He had paid the ferryman's toll for 23,000 souls. But there was no time for a state funeral. There was no time for pomp and circumstance. The French were beaten, but they were not destroyed. Soult would be back in the morning. The army had to leave on the tide. Moore could not be taken back to England. The risk of disease and the haste of the departure made it impossible. He would have to be buried in Corunna. And so preparations were made for one of the most famous burials in history. Not in a cathedral, not with a choir, but in the dark, on a rampart overlooking the sea, with only his staff and a few tired soldiers to bid him farewell. The hero of Corunna would remain in Spain forever, a sentinel left behind to guard the coast where his army had escaped the trap. The darkness that settled over Corunna on the night of January the 16th was heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. The guns had finally fallen silent, leaving only the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves against the harbor walls and the distant, confused murmur of an army trying to escape. In a house near the citadel, the body of Sir John Moore lay still. There was no time for a state funeral, no time to embalm the body for transport back to Westminster Abbey. The French were beaten, but they were not gone. Their campfires still burned on the ridges, and with the coming of dawn, their cannon would speak again. The order was absolute. The army must be aboard the transports and gone by morning. So in the dead of night, a small party of officers and men performed one of the most poignant duties in British military history. They carried the general's body out into the gloom. They did not have a coffin. There was none to be found in the chaos of the evacuation. Instead, they wrapped him in his military cloak, the same heavy wool coat he had worn through the blizzards of the retreat. They walked to the ramparts of the citadel, a quiet spot overlooking the bay. The ground was hard and stony. A grave was dug hastily, the soldiers working by the dim, flickering light of lanterns, their spades striking sparks against the granite. It was a scene of almost Gothic melancholy, later immortalized in the verses of Charles Wolfe. Not a drum was heard, not a funeral note. As his course to the rampart we hurried. There were no prayers read by a bishop, no volleys fired over the grave. The chaplain hurried through the service, his voice low, competing with the sounds of the distant pickets. The officers stood around the open earth, their faces grim, tears cutting tracks through the grime of battle on their cheeks. They were burying more than a man, they were burying the heart of the army. As the earth was shoveled back in, covering the cloak-wrapped figure, the sense of urgency was palpable. They were leaving him alone in the land he had died to save. They stamped the earth down, marked the spot, and turned away. They had to run. Down in the harbor, the scene was the antithesis of the quiet dignity on the ramparts. It was a scene of pandemonium. The Royal Navy was performing a miracle of logistics, rowing thousands of men out to the waiting transports in the pitch black. The boats were overloaded, the sailors exhausted. The water was choked with debris. But the true horror of the evacuation was taking place on the beach. The cavalry and the artillery drivers had managed to get some of their horses to the shore, hoping to crane them aboard the ships. But there was no time, and the sea was too rough. The order was given, no horses were to be left for the French. What followed was a massacre that hardened soldiers would remember with a shudder for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of horses, loyal beasts that had carried the men through the snow, starved with them, and charged with them, were led onto the sand. They were shot, stabbed, or had their throats cut. The beach ran red with blood. The screaming of the terrified animals mixed with the shouting of the officers and the creaking of the oars. It was a waste of life that seemed to epitomize the grim necessity of the entire campaign. The carcasses were left to wash in the tide, a grotesque feast for the gulls at dawn. As the sun began to rise on the 17th, the French woke to find the British positions empty. Marshal Soult, realizing his prey was escaping, rushed his artillery forward to the heights overlooking the bay. The French guns began to fire on the transport ships. The water erupted in geysers of spray. Panic rippled through the fleet. Captains cut their anchor cables, not waiting to weigh them, and unfurled their sails. The ships jostled and collided in their haste to get out of range. Their decks crowded with exhausted, seasick soldiers who watched the coast of Spain recede with thousand-yard stares. They were leaving behind their dead, their horses, and their reputation. To the soldiers huddled on the decks, it felt like a defeat. They did not yet know that history would judge it differently. They only knew that they were alive and that they were going home. Back on the shore, the French army marched into Corunna. Marshal Soult, a man of honor, learned of Moore's death and the manner of his burial. In a gesture that speaks to the strange chivalry of the Napoleonic Wars, Soult did not desecrate the grave. Instead, he ordered a monument to be built over it. He recognized in Moore a kindred spirit, a great soldier who had done his duty to the bitter end. The French cannon that had killed him fired a salute over his grave, a final tribute from one warrior to another. The fleet disappeared over the horizon, carrying the survivors of the Shorncliffe experiment back to England. They left Sir John Moore alone with his glory, sleeping on the ramparts, keeping a silent watch over the sea that had been his army's salvation. The escape was complete. The man was gone, but the legend was just beginning. When the transport fleet finally limped into the harbours of Portsmouth and Plymouth in late January 1809, the sight that greeted the British public was one of horror. The soldiers who disembarked were not the heroes of a glorious conquest. They were scarecrows. They were riddled with typhus, their uniforms were rags, and their eyes held the vacant stare of men who had looked into the abyss. In the coffee houses of London and the corridors of Westminster, the knives were out immediately. The campaign was branded a disaster. The opposition politicians railed against the government, calling Corunna a shameful flight, a second Yorktown, a waste of blood and gold. For a brief, volatile moment, the reputation of Sir John Moore was dragged through the mud, his name synonymous with failure. But history is a patient judge, and as the dust settled, the true magnitude of what Moore had achieved began to emerge from the fog of political bickering. Moore had not defeated Napoleon, but he had done something arguably more important. He had stopped him. By luring the emperor north into the mountains of Galicia, Moore had derailed the entire French conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Because Napoleon was chasing Moore through the snow, he was not marching on Lisbon. He was not seizing Seville. He was not crushing the Spanish junta. Moore had bought time, precious, irreplaceable time, for the Spanish resistance to regroup and for the British government to prepare a new army. It was a strategic sacrifice of the highest order. Napoleon, furious and frustrated, left Spain in January, never to return. The Spanish ulcer remained open, a bleeding wound in the side of his empire that would eventually drain it of its strength. But the most enduring legacy of Corunna was not strategic, it was human. The 23,000 men Sir John Moore saved did not simply fade away. They healed, they were re-equipped, and crucial to the fate of Europe, they returned. When Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal later that year to take command, he did not have to build an army from scratch. He was handed a corps of veterans who had survived the worst that war could throw at them. He was handed the Light Division, the men of the 43rd, the 52nd, and the 95th Rifles, who had been forged in Moore's Shorncliffe experiment and tempered in the fire of the retreat. These men were no longer raw recruits. They were the hardest soldiers in the world. They knew they could beat the French. They had done it at Elvina. Wellington, a man notoriously stingy with his praise, acknowledged the debt. He knew that the weapon he would wield with such devastating effect at Salamanca, Vittoria, and eventually Waterloo had been fashioned by the hands of John Moore. The discipline, the marksmanship, the skirmishing tactics, these were Moore's gifts to the nation, preserved by his sacrifice. In the end, Sir John Moore was the John the Baptist to Wellington's Messiah. He was the one who prepared the way, who endured the wilderness so that the final victory could be won. He never heard the cheers of the crowds in London, nor did he wear the laurels of the conqueror. He lies there still, in the quiet garden of San Carlos in Corunna, listening to the Atlantic swell. But every time a British rifleman took aim in the years that followed, every time a square held firm against the French cavalry, it was the spirit of Sir John Moore standing in the ranks. He saved the army that saved Europe, and in the annals of military history, there is no greater epitaph than that.